All right, so we're going to look into the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Article 6. And it starts off like this. The state parties to the present covenant recognize the right to work. Let's stop there. So, they recognize the right to work. Does having a right produce an obligation? If you have a right, do you have to use it? The answer to that question would be an astounding no, because a right produces no obligation, but a choice. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms of Canada, 1982, Article 3. Every citizen of Canada has the right to vote in an election. All right, so the citizen, the statutory creature here in Canada, has the right to vote. Now come voting time. Will the police come and knock on your door? Will the government come and knock on your door and say, listen, it's election time. You have the right to vote, so you must use your right to vote? Of course not. So that teaches us that a right doesn't produce an obligation, but it gives you a choice. Looking back into the International Covenant, Article 6, the state parties to the present covenant recognize the right to work, which includes the right of everyone. That's the subject and the player here. Now, the everyone is referring to a man or a woman, to a human being, which includes the right of everyone to the opportunity to gain his. Look at the personal pronoun, his. So the everyone must refer to the man or woman, because the personal pronoun is his. Everyone the opportunity to gain his living by work, which he freely chooses or accepts. So there it is. You have the right to work, and you can freely choose and accept to work because it's a right. And if you freely choose and accept to work, then what you are doing, you are gaining your own living by the work that you will be doing. If you choose to use the right to work, then you take the responsibility to gain your own living, to provide your own living for yourself. The resources that you acquire through your work is meant specifically to be used for your living. Notice that. It says everyone to the opportunity to gain his living. That's the subject matter, his living. So once again, you have the right to work. And if you freely choose and accept to use your right to work, then you are going to be gaining your own living. The responsibility falls upon your back to provide a living. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Article 11. The state parties to the present covenant recognize the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, including adequate food, clothing, and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. So everyone has a right. The man or the woman has a right. And that right is to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family. Personal pronouns again. Including adequate food, clothing, and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. This or those are the rights that everyone has. Now, if everyone wants to exercise those rights, that's up to them. They possess the right, but possessing the right doesn't force you to use it. Just like the citizen has the right to vote, they can't be forced to use the right. Well, here, the everyone has the right to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, and it's up to you to exercise that right. The way the government officials have allowed the standard of living to increase in the past 3 or 4 years here in Canada, it's placed a heavy burden upon people who are exercising their right to work. Even through their right to work, they're not providing an adequate living for themselves. They're falling short. that are having trouble to buy food, trouble to pay the mortgage, trouble to pay the loans, because everything is so much more expensive than it was. The man and the woman has the right to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, including adequate food, clothing, and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. That's the right that you have. Now remember that the international covenants themselves place the obligation upon our countries, upon our governments, to make sure that they give effect to these rights, whether they want to or not. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 2, subsection 2, teaches us this. We're not already provided for by existing legislative or other measures. We're not already provided for in the domestic law, in the government law. Each state party to the present covenant undertakes to take the necessary steps in accordance with its constitutional process and with the provisions of the present covenant to adopt such laws or other measures as may be necessary to give effect to the rights recognized in the present covenant. So they have the obligation to give effect to the rights recognized in the covenant. The governments and the agents working on behalf of the government are not to take any actions aimed at the destruction of our rights. And they are not to deny us of the rights, because it is a legal and lawful obligation upon them. So we have the right to work. And if we exercise the right to work, then we are choosing to gain our own living by that work. But if we exercise not the right to work, then there is still a right that remains that we have for an adequate living. And I want to say a few things here, but I'm going to hold my tongue. And I'm simply going to say this. You who call yourselves Canadian citizens and who have been indoctrinated by the government, what makes you think that all the natural resources in this country that you call your country, what makes you think that the government has the right to those resources, or that the government has the right to part out those resources to a limited number of few? Well, they don't, and they're doing it anyways. And if your heart's so itchy that you can't accept what the law really says, well, your resource for your adequate living doesn't come from taxpayers' dollars, ding dong. It's to come from the natural resources of Canada that they're stealing from you while you call yourself a citizen and you call yourself a member of the country and so proud of it. The steps to be taken by a state party to the present covenant to achieve the full realization of this right, the right to work, shall include technical and vocational guidance and training programs, policies, and techniques. What are they saying? Well, we're going to give you an education. That's why you go to school, right? That's what you've been taught, right? That's how you've been indoctrinated, right? Well, why am I in school? Well, you're in school to get an education so you can get a job, so you can use your right to work and you can gain your own living. Well, we let a few individuals here in Canada take the oil and make the profit off of it. Take the gold, take the lumber, take the lithium, take all the natural elements and make a profit off them while you struggle to pay your bills. And if you're so smart and you got it all together, let me tell you a little something here. You know the hydro that you pay for? That hydroelectricity? You know, there's a public side and a private side to these systems. And they take the resources on the private side and they sell them. They sell the hydro and they keep the profit for themselves. Not only that, whatever money they make on the public side, right? They take that profit and they pour it into the private side. And they increase their infrastructure on the private side so they can sell more of the resources and make more money off your back. Did you know that was going on? So the law says that if you choose and accept to use your right to work, then the state party must provide you an education and prepare you and get you ready to use your right to work. The International Covenant, Article 13. The state parties to the present covenant recognize the right of everyone to an education. Listen to that. They recognize the right of everyone to an education. So you have a right to an education. Does it produce an obligation? Does a right produce an obligation? They agree that education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and the sense of its dignity, and shall strengthen respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. So that's the first and primary purpose of education, to teach you about human rights, to teach you about fundamental freedoms, to teach you what I teach you on this channel here. That was their obligation, to teach you how human rights operate and how they are given effect. They further agree that education shall enable all persons. Now notice the subject and the player here. All persons to participate effectively in a free society. Well, what society are they talking about? The Masons? What society are they talking about? Well, the democratic society. That's what they're referring to. And that's why the subject or the player has changed to a person. Because you only operate as a person, as a statutory creature within the democratic society. In the democratic society, you're a worker. You're an electrician. You're a plumber. You're a mechanic. You're a cook. You're a teacher. You're a lawyer. You're a police officer. You're a statutory creature within the democratic society. The state parties to the present covenant recognize that with a view to achieving the full realization of this right. So the full realization of this right is to be able to enable all persons to participate effectively in a free and democratic society. It's to enable them to have education, to teach them. And why do they have to teach them? Why do they have to be educated? Well, because they're fulfilling their right to work. Remember, we just read it, right? That because they chose to use their right to work, now the state party has the obligation to educate them through technical and vocational training. Now you will go to school and you will operate as a student, as a statutory creature in the democratic society. And you're only there because they claimed that you used or chose to use your right to work. But I'm 5 years old. I'm 6 years old. How can I use my right to work? How can I exercise that right in order to put the obligation to have to go to school and get an education? Well, it's because the constructive registered holder over your patrimony, and your patrimony is the amount of money or is the security that is basically your percentage of the natural wealth and resources of Canada. Well, that government agent, right, because you were a minor, he made the declaration that you, little child, you are going to use your right to work. Therefore, you have obligations now, because now you are considered a statutory creature and you have to be educated. And therefore, we can make your education compulsory, an obligation. Well, I thought a right didn't produce an obligation. It doesn't produce an obligation on a man or a woman. But at this point, you are no longer recognized in your full legal capacity. You are recognized as a student. You are recognized as a statutory creature. And the decision has been made on your behalf to exercise your right to work. Therefore, the obligation on the government kicks in that they must produce or provide to you an education. And therefore, under that obligation, they make education compulsory on your behalf. Primary education shall be compulsory and available free to all. And this statement here, primary education, it doesn't mean primary school. It's not what it's saying. Secondary education in its different forms, including technical and vocational secondary education, shall be made generally available and accessible to all by every appropriate means, and in particular by the progressive introduction of free education. So within the secondary education, right, it says in its different forms, including technical and vocational secondary education. It's not referring to high school. It's not referring to secondary school. Primary education and secondary education, if you look at it, it is a group. It is a subject. And under that subject, there are different obligations and responsibilities. Now, when you look at secondary education, it includes technical and vocational education. So you go to police school, right? What do you call it? You go to learn about computers. What do you call it? You go to become a mechanic or an engineer or an electrician. What do you call it? Those are technical and vocational studies or education. Everything that requires technical or vocational studies or education in order to work is qualified here. It falls under this description. Now notice the last part of this verse here. And in particular, by the progressive introduction of free education. So the state party had the obligation to bring in free education for technical and vocational studies. Not to make you go out and get a loan. Not to make you go out and get a student loan to pay for this education. It was their responsibility to implement and bring forth a system to respect this obligation, to respect this right for vocational and technical training to be free. And since they've already laid hold and seized upon our patrimony and forced us to use our right to work and took away our right to an adequate living, it should be no problem for them, right, to introduce free education. And Mr. Smarty Pants, this is the last time I'm going to address you in this video. You work out your own thoughts in your own mind. Go check out my website, eternallyaware.com, and it'll help you to wash your mind. Well, look, they give scholarships. Some people get free education. Some people get it. They get a scholarship and they get a free education. Oh, so they fulfilled their obligation. Oh, yes, they have. All right, Mr. Smarty Pants. International law was not referring for some people to get a free education. International law was bringing forth the fact that technical and vocational training had to become free. They were under obligation to make it free. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Article 15. Every individual. Notice the subject or the player here. Individual. What does that mean? Well, it opens up to all capacities, right? It opens up to the statutory creature. You can be an individual worker, an individual police officer, an individual lawyer, an individual judge, an individual electrician. Or it opens up to the human being, the man or the woman, because you can be an individual man, right? And here the law says every individual, well, what capacity you standing under, for you to decide, is equal before and under the law, and has the right to the equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination. So if you're saying that scholarships, granting some individuals scholarships and giving some individuals the benefit is fulfilling their obligation, then you know what they're doing? They're breaching Article 15 of the Charter. If your understanding and your operation of law is correct, right, then they're breaching Article 15 of the Charter, because they're giving some individuals a benefit and they're discriminating against others. But that's not what they're doing, because scholarships don't fulfill their obligation to introduce completely free education for technical and vocational and higher education. Higher education shall be made equally accessible to all on the basis of capacity by every appropriate means, and in particular by the progressive introduction of free education. What's higher education? What's secondary education? What's primary education? Well, higher education, right? They are referring to university level education. That was to be free also. You were not supposed to have to pay for the education to exercise your right to work. Well, why not? Well, because it's their responsibility. That's what the law says. If you choose to use your right to work, then it's their responsibility to educate you. And if it's their responsibility, then they have to pay. That's why the law says it's free education. Now, fundamental education shall be encouraged or intensified as far as possible for those persons who have not received or completed the whole period of their primary education. Now, once again, right, the subject or player is person. Well, we know that, right? It's the student. But here, what does it say? It's saying that for those who have not completed high school, they will be encouraged to seek equivalency. There will be secondary programs in operation in order to help those persons finish their primary education, get their high school diploma. And after high school, right, where do you go? Well, you go for technical and vocational training, secondary training. And after that, where do you go? You go to higher education, which are the universities. In this video, I've explained to you two ways on how to exercise your right to a free education and how to break the hold that the student loan has over your life. One simple way is to invoke the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Article 15. You go to the Human Rights Tribunal and you show that the government of Canada have systems in operation, have allowed laws to become enacted, that have allowed certain individuals to obtain free education through scholarship. And under the law, I'm entitled to equal benefit of that law without discrimination. And I have been discriminated against because I have student loans that I must pay. And those individuals had a benefit from the government and they didn't have to pay for their education. Why am I any different? And the other option is to write to the education minister a notice and demand invoking their obligations in international law to free education, which they have failed to respect, which they have not put into operation as per their obligation. And for punch number 2, you add to that notice and demand the truth about the fact that some have received free education. And in doing so, by allowing those systems to be in operation, by allowing those laws to be in operation, where only a select few can receive free education, they have discriminated against you. You have not received equal treatment within the law as an individual, even if you have paid off your student loans. There's no statutory limit here. You can require that the remedy be produced on your behalf, which is return the funds to me that I paid into this education, because it was your responsibility to pay this, and you failed. And not only did you fail, you created systems that discriminated against me personally. Don't skip step 1. Don't skip the primary step to all of this, which is make sure you have a proper claim of recognition, recognized by the government, sent to the state party, sent to the Privy Council, sent to the Attorney General, informing him of who you are and what you understand concerning international law and domestic law, so they know your standing, they know what's in your mind, they know what you understand, so they cannot play games with you. Then, and only then, should you go and make claims and demands upon your rights that they limited and abridged.